Okay, first of all, thank you very much everybody for coming. I know lots of you actually bought your tickets over a year ago. If you don't know me, my name is Michelle Ollie. I'm one of the co-producers. Another one of you lot, on a Facebook page, and 3 years later, here I am. David, thank you again for that. That was a really lovely speech. And funnily enough, you ended on my first question. Because there's a thread going through a lot of this stuff, which is the tune in, turn on, find the others phrase, which we now have on a t-shirt, sold out about a week ago. And that brings me quite nicely to my kind of meeting point with Alan and Melinda, which is on the 23rd of November 2014, on the official premiere of the Cosmic Trigger play. Melinda sat behind me in Liverpool on some rickety plastic chairs in the middle of Camp and Furnace with a crowd of people all waiting to see a play which nearly, it took us all a year to get over putting that show on. And Melinda said to me, she said, do you know, I'm happy to tell you that Alan's so pleased that I'm here because he couldn't be here tonight. He told me that he thought this play could be the start of something that people will be talking about 20 years later. And I thought, bloody hell, no pressure then. So it's an absolute delight to have him here tonight, finally, to see the play that he's actually in, to see the play that he's supported with like loads of crowdfunding videos. It's also really lovely to see all these people here who are indeed, they start something that started on that night in 2014. The guys from Sheffield, from Trustful 23. Later on we'll have the Super Red Substance guys in from Manchester. We've got the Hebden Bridge Posse. We've got Liverpool represented by Tommy Calderwood. We've got Megan from Northampton Arts Lab. Yeah, the gang's all here, mate. We've even got some brighteners in, haven't we? Got some Brighton Arts Lab? Yes. So here's my question, starting off with you, Alan. So what indeed is this counterculture thing? Is it a verb? Is it a collective noun? There's some controversy around that in the group. Dave Wybrow, who's the other reason we're all here, who the gentleman with the moustache. This is his venue, and he's the one who put up the money to make it possible for us to do this on 15 grand from the Arts Council. I'll get out of the way, and each one presenting them. So, Alan and Adam, counterculture discuss. Is it a collective noun? Is it a verb? What is it now?
Well, I was thinking about this when we did our counterculture. We did a couple of countercultural weekends or days, symposiums up in Northampton. The first one was called Under the Austerity of the Beach, and the second one was called, this was just after the referendum, was called Hexagram 23 Breaking Apart. And we were actually discussing what is counterculture. And Scroobius Pip said something very, very insightful. He said, well, of course, countercultures always fail. And they do. But that is because they are always assimilated into the overall culture. And I suggested that perhaps a good strategy would be to make your counterculture so toxic or so psychedelic that having assimilated you, society would be feeling really weird for several decades afterwards. It also occurred to me that in some ways, there is no counterculture. In some ways, counterculture is a necessary organ of culture. It's the part of culture that can criticise culture. And that is the way that culture criticises itself, and thus that culture renews itself. And if you artificially stamp out counterculture, which is I think kind of what happened in the 90s, if you kind of forbid counterculture, what will happen is culture will die. because the counterculture was a necessary organ in its body. And I don't think that there's anything in modern culture that suggests that that wasn't the case. That sort of we cut out an organ, we thought, oh, it's just an appendix, it's of no function, we can throw this away. And look what's happened. So yeah, I think that counterculture is vital, and if you haven't got counterculture, you haven't got culture.
Adam, over to you on that. With your recent film, Happy Normalisation, you start off with quite a sort of, what was quite a shocking point to me. I was like, oh my God, it's all Patti Smith's fault. When you started talking about how when artists started to depoliticise and focus on the individual, where does that fit with your idea of counterculture and where we are now? So, where were you going with that?
Well, I have a sort of rather ambiguous attitude to the counterculture. I mean, we're talking about the counterculture that grew up in the late 1960s. It came out of the failure of any left-wing politics to change the world. And what replaced it was this idea that you as an individual used culture and your attitude to culture and the way you can express yourself as a way of challenging the corrupt old politics. Inherent in that was the idea that you as an individual knew what was right. You were authentic was the phrase, whereas the man, the corrupt old politics, was fake. What that authenticity depended upon was you trusting your own instincts, not joining a party, being an individual, being yourself. And in the process, it was your own truth. That's what you're expressing. I mean, Patti Smith was one of the early, I mean, she got there very quickly. She expressed that idea very clearly. That's what culture could do. It could counter the old corrupt politics. What I argue is that actually that's become the conformity of our time. I mean, the central to mass consumer culture is the idea of expressing yourself through your clothes, through everything. I think it rescued consumer capitalism, the idea of counterculture. And I think Alan's right. In a way, it died in the 90s because it became the norm. I mean, it didn't do anything, it didn't do what it was saying, but everyone was expressing themselves and being countercultural in a very absurd way. What I think we're waiting for is a yearning for some kind of new counterculture that goes the next step. You're not going to go and put individualism back in the bottle. It's what we all believe in. It's what drives us. We're all at heart libertarians, really. But what we're yearning for is what we were just talking about earlier on, is some kind of story that can unite us all, yet at the same time allows us to feel that we're in control of our own destiny, that we're not told to do what the man used to tell us to do. And until someone does that, we're slightly lost. So in a sense, I think that the counterculture of the 60s only went half the step, and it got absorbed and it got used ruthlessly. And we're waiting for something else to come along. The danger in that is that one of the reasons why individualism was so attractive in the 60s is the generation before that said, don't believe in mythologies, look what happens, you get fascism, you get Stalinism, you get totalitarianism. So the idea of individualism became very big. The brave thing to do now is to find a mythology and say that maybe it isn't going to lead to fascism, maybe it could actually lead people towards a glorious new world, where they feel free, yet they're working together.
Do you think that might be Discordianism?
Well, I mean, like, personally, yeah, Discordianism I have a great deal of respect for and have had since I read the Illuminatus trilogy in '76 or whatever it was. But to me, the difference between Discordianism and anarchism is probably one of nuance. You know, sort of, I mean, Discordians, one of the rules of Discordianism is that you form a Discordian group, it immediately has to schism. And I kind of like that, the idea of sticking apart, as the Discordian phrase has it. But that's the same as anarchism. I mean, there were all of these, by its very nature, it means no leaders. So that means that everybody's free to define it how they want, which means that you get all of these anarcho-syndicalists, you get egotist anarchists, There are easily 40 or 50 different sorts of anarchy. My favourite is anarchy without adjectives, where they are using the phrase without adjectives, adjectively. But the thing is that ultimately we have, what both Discordianism and anarchy, as I define it, are saying, is that we have to, for decades now, we have been living in an age of mass thinking, where we have mass media, we have it's mass everything, to deal with masses of the population. So the basic social unit is the mass. I think that you have to make, the basic social unit has to be the individual. But Adam says we can't put individualism back in the bowl. Individualism did lead to a great deal of selfishness and narcissism, and yeah, there are bad things that come with individualism, but that's where we are. I think that we have to make the individual the basic social unit, because the thing with anarchy is it says no leaders, and paradoxically that means that everybody has to do the work to actually be their own leader. It doesn't just mean do whatever you want. It puts a great deal of responsibility onto the individual. And I think that what we need is individuals who are prepared to accept that responsibility. And that is the only way that we're going to get the kind of culture that we're looking for. And I think that, yeah, Discordianism, anarchy, but it has to be something that is based upon the individual, because the opposite of that is fascism. The idea that of people bound together, in unity there is strength, which is also the central idea behind religion, which means bound together in one belief. I really don't like that. I think that we have to oppose that. And the opposite of that is the individual, empowered, taking responsibility for his or her own actions. That is the exact opposite of fascism. Whether you call it Discordianism or anarchy, I'm not much bothered. It sounds like that's for me. You know?
Adam, that also sounds a little bit like the metamodernism arguments that I've sort of seen floating around online. There was an article that you wrote for The Guardian about South Park, saying that that was one of the best current examples of art telling difficult truths. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, The Guardian asked me to name the documentaries I liked, because I make documentaries. And it took me about a day, and I had to go back to them and say, well, actually, I don't like any. I sort of added on, I'm even quite thoughtful in my own, just to try and sound modest. What I said was that actually what's happened in our age, which is sort of what you were talking about in the 90s, there is a distinct lack of imagination in our journalism. There really is. Not just in television and in film, but in print as well. And I don't think it's just the internet that's destroying newspapers. If you look at the statistics, readership began to fall off in the early 90s because it just got so boring. I mean, the internet's obviously destroyed it pretty ruthlessly, but there is no imagination in the way the world is reported to us. I mean, journalism isn't just about telling you a story. It's about constructing that story and telling you what it means. And that telling you what it means has become possessed by think tanks. And when think tanks get hold of anything, they destroy it. And they're the people who feed the interviewees at the television studios these days. So what I argued was that South Park, which I just think is one of the great works of our time, actually reports on the world in a very good way. And I quoted that three-parter they did, which was called Imagination Land. I don't know if any of you saw it, but it was just a beautiful and such a sophisticated piece of journalism and work of art at the same time. The two can coexist. And it was just arguing that this really complex point is that reality can be whatever you want it to be. And some of the most important, powerful figures in our world have been invented characters. So it was musing on this idea of what reality is, but it was also about the dangers of that. And I think this is the key problem that one's up against, especially with things like anarchism and Discordianism. You can see the point, you can see where it grows out of. It grows out of that hunger, after generations of being oppressed as groups, to be an individual. But if you look at the early history of Discordianism, just briefly, the two boys who invented it, Kerry Thornley and Greg Hill, two Americans, their story epitomises exactly what happens. They invented it as a sort of parody of what politicians do. That politicians, they're saying, just make up the world. So we're going to make up the world. And they started having ridiculous conspiracy theories involving something called the Illuminati as a way of parodying it. And two things happened. One, people started to believe the conspiracy theories, and two, one of them, Kerry Thornley, started to believe that actually he was part of a conspiracy. And what that illustrates is that the dangers of individualism is that you're quite weak. When things are going well, you're confident. But when things get complex and confused and puzzled, you're on your own. And the real key thing for a political future is to find a way of allowing individuals to grow and become strong and more confident, yeah? Without them having to join together in a group which they just surrender themselves to. And no one's done that. It's squaring the circle. It's waiting to be done in some form or another. But at the moment, we are just simplified down into little nodes that are, the computers say, if you like that, then you'll like that. They care nothing for our dreams. And they just say, if you liked yesterday, you can have the yesterday again today. And that's a pretty limited world. And it's disempowering us because it's simplifying us. And it's allowing us to feel we're individuals, but we're becoming simplified little nodes. And I think we're going the other way from where we should be going. I don't know whether Discordianism or anarchism contains the answers. I suspect it has to be in tandem with something else.
Do you think it might also possibly be a generational thing? Because in the same way as the Gutenberg moment with the press was a huge cultural disruptor that, was charged the Reformation and revolution, the printing press changed the world. The net is changing the way that we're receiving information, and maybe we are at a point where we actually need to become aware of how the algorithms are gaming us. And is that something, I'm referring particularly here to the piece that you did with Rosie Kay for the MK Ultra dance group, where she interviewed some teenagers in Wolverhampton, and they were talking about Illuminati videos and about Illuminati confirmed neurology proof that they had. But there was a sort of the tinge to the way they talked. They were much more qualified about it. It wasn't like complete belief. Do you think we will eventually realise how we're being played by the way that our SEO history is being analysed and then fed back to us?
No, you should. Okay, please do.
Well, just briefly about that. I was very interested in the idea that if you're basically under 23 and you spend a lot of time online, you pretty much believe a lot of... No, you don't. This is what's very interesting. You immerse yourself in a lot of conspiracy theories that basically say that most of the major stars have been brainwashed by an alliance of the CIA, Walt Disney, MK Ultra. I think that's about it. But anyway, basically, and it only lasts for about 6 years, the brainwashing, and then begins to wear off, which is why all the stars then go weird. Like Britney Spears was the first model, and she shaved her head. That's it wearing off, and then she's redone and goes to Las Vegas and has what's called the dead eyes, and her use is now over. They live in that world. I was very interested in that because if you go back to the roots of Discordianism, it's about the very opposite. It's about challenging conspiracies and trying to be absurd about them, and you end up with that. When we then went and interviewed some kids they were between 15 and 20 in Wolverhampton, what was really fascinating is they knew it probably wasn't true, but it was awesome. It was like a wonderful dark mythology compared to the banality of the information, as I was saying earlier on, the think tank speech about microeconomics. Yeah? It was a sort of, they're out there are dark forces. And it made me realise that actually the liberals' disdain for conspiracy theories is sort of wrong. They usually say, oh, it's because stupid people believe this stuff. It's not. It's actually that the stories offer you a giant mythology which explains the fact that we don't understand the world in a way that normal, deracinated, narrow political stories and journalism completely fails to do. And in a way, they're quite sophisticated in their view of it. So there's a yearning for a mythology which brings us back to the stories we need.
And I also think that one of the reasons why people cling to conspiracy theories, even horrible conspiracy theories, ones that suggest that we're all being controlled by grey aliens or monsters or whatever. People would rather believe that monsters and grey aliens were running the world than that kind of nobody is. But at least, I mean, that it would be kind of reassuring to think that the Illuminati existed. Well, yeah, they won't completely screw up the world then, will they? It would be in their interest. However, no, it's not. It's Donald Trump, who is not part, he's not intelligent enough to be part of any conspiracy. So you just, that it is a preferable alternative a lot of the time. The conspiracy theory is actually cosy because it suggests that the world has got some sort of teleological direction, even if that is only into sort of death camps for liberals or whatever, that is better than the fact that, oh Jesus Christ, this is all just chaos, this is all just things happening, and then in the news studio they will edit these completely random, horrifying events until we've got some sort of narrative. And that narrative we will call reality. I mean, that's where we're at, you know. It's not just people like Adam who are kind of finding a narrative in bits of footage. This is how the news is made. Yeah.
But it's getting even more complicated because, to go back to the counterculture, if you listen to some of what Donald Trump said during his campaign, some of the speeches, they sounded like a 1960s counterculture person. They really did. He was borrowing from that. There's a guy who I made a short film about who's advising, well, he's sort of slightly out of power now, but up until last year, he was advising President Putin, called Vladislav Surkov, who steals ruthlessly, not only from counterculture, from radical ideas of art and postmodernism, who puts out all sorts of false information, invents false political parties, which is what people have done for a long time, but then he goes one further step. He tells you he's done it. So you don't know which is, you know everything might be fake, at which point reality begins to dissolve because you don't know which is the party you're voting for, whether it's real or whether it's fake. So you're completely destabilised. But sitting in there is another further step, which it brings us right back to Discordianism, is reality is what you make it. And this is the thing that individuals are beginning to appreciate, that you can make reality whichever way you want it to. But the real question is who decides what that reality is and what's it for? And this is the question that's waiting to be decided.
Well, I'd also note that I was talking with some people the other day that back in the day, say 10, 20 years ago, it was really difficult to do anything. It was a real slog. To get your idea, to bring it to fruition, that was going to take an awful lot of backbreaking work, and you might not even make it to the end of that work. These days, it seems that there's less resistance, probably because of the advance of technology that has made a lot of things a lot more convenient. It seems like there's less resistance in the air, so good ideas can happen and be brought to fruition more easily. And so can really, really terrible ideas. It just means that we're living in a much, much faster world where we basically, these days you only have to come up with the idea and the next day it's on 20 multiple platforms, it has poured into reality. You know, you barely had to do any work at all. You just thought of something and then there it was. Which is not necessarily, that doesn't actually sound like utopia to me. That sounds like quite the opposite.
I mean, yeah, you're right. I don't think it's just technology. It's also because the old gatekeepers have given up, have lost confidence. I mean, I work at the Heart of the Beast, I work in the BBC, which used to have, up to about 5 years ago, very confident editorial, strong people at high levels, both men and women. They've sort of lost confidence now because they have absolutely no idea what's going on. I mean, I was even talking to the head of news, who was telling me about one evening news conference last year where they just all turned to each other and we have no idea what's going on. I mean, it really was. It was that night when a coup was just beginning in Turkey. The guy had driven along the beach in Nice, killing lots of people, and something really bad financial had happened. And they just did not know what was going on. They had no idea what the line was. Yeah? Because that's what news is all about. You have to decide what the line is. It's not propaganda, it's just how do we make sense of this? And they didn't know how to do that. And that's what's up for grabs at the moment. I think things could change very quickly. The problem is that you're right, people put up things online, but they tend to put up rather banal things. I mean, the two moments which could have actually challenged the structure of power in the world, the Occupy movement and Tahrir Square, the Arab Spring in certain areas of it, both failed because they didn't actually have an idea of what they wanted. They knew how to gather together, but then when it came to it, they just collapsed. So I feel that the structure is, things could change very quickly because there's no confidence among those who decide the line any longer. But with those who do want to change things, they haven't got a line either.
That really sounds like Zizek talking. A couple of years ago, I saw Zizek do a talk at the South Bank when he talked about how where we are right now is that we haven't quite figured out who the new leaders are, and they're not necessarily leading types. But he said exactly that the problem with the Occupy movement was they were just there to be there and to point out the problem, but they didn't have the solution. Does this mean that we've advertised the eschaton?
Well, I mean, like, I'd have to stress that the word immanentize is very different to the word immanentize. They mean different things. Immanentize, that means to make something more imminent, to bring it forward in time, to bring it closer. Immanentize means to make it a condition of the universe, of space-time, to say that actually this quality is inherent in everything. So the way that I see apocalypse, yeah, it is immanent. It's inherent in our situation. We're never going to reach it. The apocalypse is the war that never comes, and it's always personal. It's sort of, and in a way, we're reaching it every second, but the world is ending in Revelation every second, and we're getting another one that is going to end in Revelation a couple of seconds later. That is the pace of things today, and I think that, like, as Adam was saying, we do need to have an idea of what we're doing. That wouldn't be a bad idea, would it, to actually have an idea of what we were doing? I mean, Michelle was telling me earlier that Slavoj Žižek, when she'd seen him, he'd been talking about the V for Vendetta film, and he said that he would sell his mother to see the sequel to that film. No, save your mum. That's not going to happen. But I knew what he meant. I mean, because what he was saying was, yeah, what happens the next day when you've overthrown the government, when you've got rid of the man? What happens then? He was saying he'd like to see all of the committee meetings and the legislative meetings and all the rest of it. And I would too. I mean, I finished the original book at that point because I was kind of saying, look, over to you. That sort of, this is when the government is removed or crumbled or whatever, then that's when the struggle begins. It is not the struggle to overthrow the tyranny. That happens all the time and generally replaces the tyranny with an equal tyranny. The struggle really begins at the moment when you actually start thinking, what are we going to replace this with? And there are a few ideas. We have to make them a bit more solid than just ideas. But things like a basic living wage, that would sort out quite a lot. I'd like to see, if I've got a wish list here,
Go for it.
I'd like to see first an end to the nation state, because nations, we only invented them a couple of 100 years ago. Most of the people turning up at Ellis Island, they can tell you what village they came from, but not which country. because there was no reason to know which country you lived in, because your concerns were those of your village and the area around it. I think that the internet is gradually making national boundaries evaporate, because national boundaries used to be based upon geographical distance and geographical features. Those features are irrelevant now that we can talk to people on the other side of the world instantly. Our cultures are sort of exchanging sort of fluids at an even greater rate. Now, I tend to think that sort of we could get rid of the idea of nations, the idea of having small communities that were responding to their own particular problems with people who actually knew about the community and understood those problems. It wouldn't be, all we need is an administration. We don't need people to tell us what to do. We just need something that is a competent administration. I'd suggest a niche AI. There's one running the Hong Kong transport system. That sounds like a pretty complicated thing, but it's running it perfectly. Roll on Skynet, I suppose, is what I'm saying. There's a lot of very basic changes that we could make that would change things immeasurably. The foregoing was just a brief sampling.
That sounds a little bit like John Higgs has been talking about with his new book, Watling Street, when he did the first talk here on the first Saturday of the run. And you were talking about the difference between nations and spirit of place. And I think that kind of psychogeography idea, our idea of our identity being tied not just to the land but to the people around us, is that what we're kind of moving towards with whatever the hell it is that's happening here, with like the arts labs and the super weird and the cosmic triggers?
Well, I think that place seems to be a part of it. This might just be me. I think that pretty clearly we grow out of our landscape and our times. The phenomenon in fractal mathematics, the Mandelbrot set. If you zoom into the Mandelbrot set enough times, you will find these little subsets that are called Julia sets. These are all slightly different, and their qualities depend upon where in the overall Mandelbrot set they emerge from. I think that to a degree we're all Julia sets, that we emerge from our specific place at our specific time. And even if we move away from that place, we find another place that we make connections with. I think that we are our landscape to a great degree. We create the landscape around us from the material that we find inside our heads. We create it from ourselves until we are living basically inside our own imagination. Everything in this room, the clothes that we wear, and the language that we're speaking, it started out as an idea that somebody had, and we've unpacked all that into a physical reality. I think that hang on, I've completely lost the thread there.
We make our own reality.
Yeah.
Our spirit of place.
Well, yeah, and the place, everybody's somewhere, and the place around you will be informing your idea of who you are. I've heard recently in New Scientist that the people around you, your consciousness is not entirely your own. It's made up of the people that you have around you. Parts of their consciousness have been integrated into yours. And I think that with our environment, with our landscape, the same thing happens. If we're living in a place that is a shithole, then sooner or later you're going to be looking around at the place that you live in and you're going to think, right, so I'm a shit. You're going to internalise that. If you're living in a place that you understand to be a rich mythological landscape, like something out of the Arabian Nights, then you're maybe going to feel a bit mythical. You're maybe going to feel a bit empowered. I think that place is very, very important. The landscape that I talked about in Jerusalem, since the book was published, it's as if I've spurred them on to destroy it even faster. So yeah, that's nearly all gone now. But if you understand what that place was about, then it is still there with all of its historical facts, all of its associations. The thing to do is find out about a place, enrich places with their meaning, because meaning is the most important currency. It's the thing that we lose when we decide not to have mythologies anymore, because yes, mythologies led to Stalinism, mythologies led to fascism. When we don't have mythologies, then the meaning bleeds out of everything. It's like a half-life. You know, the meaning has a half-life, and eventually you'll be left with just dull inert lead. So, yeah, restore meaning to things, because we, as far as we know, are the most advanced intellectual form of life in the universe. So, if it's not up to us to instill things with meaning, who is it up to? Yeah, find meaning in everything, and that is a way of actually re-empowering the landscape around us and the people that are in it.
That was a great one. Who here have actually read Jerusalem? Hands up. Everyone else, you need to read Jerusalem, just trust me, okay. I wanted to talk a little bit, I wanted to get back to Robert Anton Wilson actually. How much Wilson have you read, Adam? Do you have any favourite books or any favourite ideas of his?
I'm afraid my interest in Discordianism is more in the origins of it with Hill and Thornley. Could I just go back to the sense of place? Because I think this is really, really interesting question. Does that sense, I agree with you, people need a sense of meaning and the connection with the environment around them, what the story is. But does that sense of place always lead to a dangerous unity against others? That's the question that lurks in all this. And I don't know if any of you heard of a place called Rojava. Have you heard about this?
Yeah.
Rojava's fascinating. It's in northern Syria. It's the area that the Kurds got in about 2012 when the Assad regime just basically let them have it. And ever since then, they've been their inspiration is their leader called Abdullah Öcalan, who's been in prison on an island in the Sea of Marmara for about 15 years. And he went from being a sort of hardline Stalinist to reading the books of an American anarchist called Murray Bookchin, who's also quite critical of anarchism, got inspired by this, and they are trying to create what they see as a new sense of place, which is also connected globally. And they see it as they say they see it as a future model for the whole of the Middle East. It's one of these things that's going on under the radar, because the radar is just sending bombs to bomb everything around them. And they are on the front line. I mean, they're fighting to retake Raqqa at the moment. But it's full of idealists. Idealists from all over the world are going out there, not just Kurds, to try and build a new community. Part of it, when you read some of their stuff, it sounds a bit like local government politics, and it could be incredibly dull. They have sort of think tanks on future economics and things like this. But there is a real sense of how can we actually take Kurdish nationalism and transform it into something else that goes forward into the future and just doesn't live with those old mythologies, yet also borrows from the sense that we are Kurds and we live here. I think it's really fascinating, and I think, just finally back to the apocalypse, I think our problem is we suffer from a continual sense of crisis in this country, when in fact there isn't one. I mean, of course there are all sorts of real problems in this country, and there is increasing inequalities and really bad things. But this idea that we live in a continual state, that tomorrow there's going to be another crisis, tomorrow there's going to be another crisis, stops people thinking and detaches them from reality. And I think my own assistant broadcasting organisation helps foster that. All sorts of people help foster it. It's got into the blood now, this sense of crisis. And I just think that's really dangerous, because actually what's happening is if you go to Rojava, where they have a sense of perpetual crisis, I think it calms down. It's like the eye of the storm, and you have to think about the future in a real way. At the moment, our media, our politicians, our think tanks are like drama queens. They are just continually having hissy fits every day. I know terrible things happen. I know there was a terrible bombing in Manchester, but the sense of total crisis is not really true. And it's used to, no, not used, it's not used, it's not a conspiracy. It's just, it suits everyone to stop them really actually having to do something about the future. And that includes the left, I'm afraid.
And I think that's exactly true. I think that, I think back in the day, during, say, the 80s or the 60s to the 50s to the 80s, where the Cold War was raging and the big thing hanging over everybody's heads was the perpetual will they or won't they crisis of nuclear weapons. Now, what that tended to do is to divide people into two camps. The people who, when they thought about the future, thought, well, the future will just be the same as today, but with smaller appliances. And the other group of people thought, well, there's not going to be a future, because everything is going to be destroyed in some sort of final motion cloud. Now, the problem with both of those points of view is that nobody's preparing for a future. Nobody's seeing their way past that mushroom cloud exclamation mark. This is the main problem with ideas, crude ideas of apocalypse. I like the idea of apocalypse in its meaning of revelation. That when we finally understand something about the way that we are putting the world together, that we think, oh, that was completely wrong. And at that moment, the world falls apart. The world ends, and hopefully we have something better. But sort of, yeah, I mean, we have to stop that kind of apocalyptic thinking which paralyses you, which sort of makes it's pointless doing anything. And so everybody freezes. And I think we're already suffering from that enough already. It seems to me that culturally we romped through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s in our haste to get to this promised Jetsons future. And that sort of when, around about the 90s, the 95, something like that, we suddenly thought, oh shit, this is the future, isn't it? This is what we were actually racing to get towards, and we don't understand it, and this is a bit frightening and a bit alienating. Let's just mark time culturally until we can work out what to do. Let's just march on the spot. Let's just repeat the last 2 or 3 decades of this century that we've grown comfortable with. Rather than come up with anything adequate to the 21st century. I read a wonderful article, this was about a year ago. It was an article called bracket, 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 1973, bracket, bracket, bracket. And it was talking about, it was referring to what Adam was saying earlier about journalism and the way that our reality is constructed, the way that journalists report our reality. And this guy was looking back to something that was very popular in 1973, which was the new journalism, which was journalism that accepted that no, objectivity is impossible. All journalism is subjective, so the most honest journalism is that which admits that it is subjective. And on one hand, that gave you the admittedly enjoyable at first excesses of Hunter S. Thompson, but it also gave you some really penetrating journalism that was able to talk about its times. Yet we need some of that. We need sort of stuff that is adequate to the present day. No.
That's exactly right. But then new journalism is a product of the rise of individualism, because what it got at was, no, we're not just patrician journalists telling you what's what. We're going to tell you how people feel inside their heads. And they got in there and they did really good stuff. And then it ran out of steam somewhere in the 1990s and ended up in celebrity journalism, telling you what Britney Spears feels. What we're waiting for is the journalism of our time that will re-engage us and make the world magic and exciting, because it will connect with something that's going on in the back of our brains. And we don't know what that is until the journalists come along and tell us it. And no one's done it yet. And that's why all these completely absurd, weird things happened, is there is no pattern being explained to us. So people are searching. And I think that's right. I'm a very optimist about the future of journalism. People want stories. People want the world to explain to them. It's just the journalism at the moment is so boring. And it's so detached from what we know is the complexity of reality that we've given up. Like you said, you gave up reading the news. Why read the news? I mean, the old idea of the news was that it was part of the democratic process, is the journalists would go out, find really bad things, and tell us, we get very angry, we go to our politicians and say, do something about it. Somewhere in the early 90s, that was broken. They'd come back and tell us really bad things. We'd go, oh, that's really bad, and nothing would happen. Look at since the 2008 crisis, nothing. No one's been prosecuted. So what's the point of reading the news? It's a good question. What is the point? What does it do for you? In the past, you were part of the democratic process. If that's broken, you're left out of it. Why bother? But we do want stories, and we're waiting for the next big story to come.
And I found that when at some point, I forget why, but back in the 1990s, the government announced that by such and such a date, every home in the land will have digital television. And I thought, well, they haven't consulted me. So I thought, well, I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to have a digital television. So eventually, when all of my different channels were just showing snow because they'd sort of cut it out, I thought, okay, so I haven't got a television now. I can watch DVDs, but I'm not watching television. And because I don't buy a newspaper very often, I became completely out of touch with world events. And for the first couple of weeks, because I had always religiously watched the news, for the first couple of weeks it was very disorienting, because actually big things were happening in the world that I knew nothing about. So people came up to me, I mean this was just after Osama bin Laden had reputedly been killed and then buried at sea. And I had people coming up and saying, well, what about Osama bin Laden? And I'd say, yeah. What about him? He's a bit of a lad, isn't he? Yeah. But you actually find that after a while you don't need to know all of that rubbish. You can generally get a pretty clear picture of what's going on by reading a couple of intelligent magazines. You can actually forget about that world because it is irrelevant most of the time. What are you going to do about it? Yeah.
But you do need to know about it.
You do need to know. But you don't need to know it as filtered through the news.
It's going back to that thing of model agnosticism and just everything needs a pinch of salt now because everything is so blended out. We've run out of time, haven't we, Michelle? Is that right?
Now.
What, sorry?
We've got some Q&A.
We've got some Q&A time now, so I'm sure we must have some questions after that. Over to you guys. Right, David.
Adam, I listened to your interview with Adam Buxton very recently, and you talked about being very sympathetic with left-wing politics, but you're also quite damning about how there seems to be a lack of momentum and activity within the left, and you said, look at what the right have achieved with Brexit and with Trump, that we can make these changes for good and for bad. But I felt that you were maybe thinking about how our press seems to be overwhelmingly right-wing. Do you think the left is perpetually on the back foot, that the voice of the left just isn't heard across this country because we only really have The Guardian and perhaps The Mirror as examples of newspapers that give a left-wing voice. The rest is overwhelmingly right, and the left doesn't really stand a chance.
I think the problem with that argument is that you have to realise that the press in America and the press here, well, the press in America were overwhelmingly anti-Trump, yes?
Yeah.
That's not so much true here with Brexit. But what I was trying to say, I haven't listened to that interview, I did it a long time ago, but I presume what I was saying was that Brexit happened despite the elites. I mean, ever since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the elites in this country and in America have been completely wrong about everything. Yes? They didn't see the Berlin Wall collapsing. They didn't see, they didn't see 9/11. You can't That's not one can put in the frame. They didn't see the economic crisis of 2008, they didn't see Trump, and they didn't see Brexit. And what I was arguing is that if you organise well, and you have a powerful, and you connect with a powerful emotional force that's in the back of people's minds, you can use the electoral process to get power. And I think that's a really, and I was trying to say, despite the fact that I really don't like Donald Trump, and despite the fact that I don't really like the idea of Brexit, I'm optimistic because it shows that you can actually use the electoral process to change the world. Well, that's great. Now let's think up some ideas about how we do want to change the world, instead of whinging and trying to pretend that it's either America, Russia, or Cambridge Analytica that won the election. It wasn't. It was actually people who were really angry, pissed off, feeling alone, were given a very big button that just said "fuck off" on it, and they pressed it. Yeah?
I think another thing that plays into what David was saying was that yes, the media they were anti-Trump in America. However, they gave him much more coverage than anybody else. And I remember reading an interview with some of them, and they were saying, yeah, they were working at one of the big television companies. They were saying, yeah, I know that we are kind of doing the wrong thing by just putting Trump on all of the shows, but it's such good television.
But that's how you get power. I mean, the people I work with, television producers, are completely amoral. I mean, they're not immoral, they're amoral. They want a good story. So if you come along and you're like Trump, they'll give you the time.
Farage on the BBC.
Yeah, but instead of going, oh, that's terrible, go, well, hang on, why don't we do that? You know, I mean, my colleagues would love good stuff. I mean, there are guidelines, there are gatekeepers, but the gatekeepers, as I say, are less powerful these days. It's wide open.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm really slagging off the left for, is not having a positive vision of the future that connects imaginatively with the fears and loneliness at the heart of millions of people here in America. They're just not doing it. They're sitting there hand-wringing and blaming the Russians. It's just wrong.
Gentleman in the white t-shirt with the
So much earlier, you were talking about individualism being, it's just here, we can't change that now. And that does mean that a lot of people just want to press that big button that says, fuck this. But what Discordianism gives you, that obviously I'm not saying it is what we need, what it gives you is, don't trust those stories. And the danger of saying everyone has to be a leader, everyone has to be their own leader, is that a lot of people really don't want to, and so press an easy button, or they'll be misled by an egotistical anarchist who does, pretend to offer something better. And it's not really a question, it's other than, isn't any form of, if individualism is the way, if it doesn't have the Discordian part of, don't trust any of that crap, it's all lies, or, it's all silly, we're going to make up a made-up religion. Without that distrust and realising that it's all a big joke, it's far too easy to get tyranny back in terms of, under cover of individualism.
But I think that sort of generally the individualists that I've known, most of them, you're starting out with that complete mistrust. Yes, I think that don't believe anything necessarily unless, was it as the great Martin Gay said, believe half of what you see and none of what you hear. And that's a pretty good sort of basic kind of approach to things.
I think rather than just don't trust it, see it as a joke. It's even healthier than mistrust it.
Well, but seeing things as a joke can be dangerous because some things aren't jokes, and if you're trying to make everything into a joke, that can bite you in the arse. It's sort of, but I agree that a skepticism, it's. I was doing a talk about magic the other day in Northampton, and the guy said, "Who here is a practicing magician?" I put my hand up. He said, "Who here is sceptical about magic?" I put my hand up. Of course, of course, I think that skepticism is a great place to start with everything, and that's where Discordianism starts.
Just at the risk of being slightly contrary about this, I was in West Virginia during the election campaign for Trump. And everyone there you spoke to sounded like how you describe a Discordian. They completely distrusted everyone. They knew that they were just making it all up in Washington. What's the point? Here's this guy who's expressing this. Why not vote for it? Now, instead of getting depressed about that, I think you should be rather pleased about that, because it shows that everything is up for grabs now. And that really it's up to people to come up with strong, well, I wouldn't use the word mythology, but powerful emotional stories that actually begin to make sense of the reality that people are experiencing today, which Trump was a step towards, but I think he's going to fail. There's going to be even more anger, more discordianism. Grab it.
Sounds like we need to get creative.
Well, actually, this is. I was just going to say. Yeah, we've seen how I agree with Adam completely that this is what Trump has done. He has proven the fact that you can, with enough sort of force and delivery, you can more or less get any idea into reality. I think that sort of. I lost the thread again. What was it? We were just.
We were talking about how what Trump's been capable of Trump's achieved, and how it could you have that kind of motley, I guess.
Yeah, that you can push this thing through. I think that the thing to remember is that, we've seen how well Donald Trump has done. After he got himself in, he never thought he was going to do that. He hadn't got any plan, much as we wouldn't have if we actually accomplished the revolution. So he's just wandering around like an idiot, still out on the campaign trail even though he's won. All of that theatre that got him into office, all of that, we are much, much better at that stuff than the right wing. We are much more creative. Yes, we should, as Adam says, we should be able. Why can't we do that?
Right, one more question, or two quick ones. Robert Temple over there, the author of the Serious Mysteries. What's your question?
I have 23 questions. I can't remember what they all are, but Adam, your wonderful mini-series, The Power of the Dead, is not listed on your IMDb entry.
I don't know if I've ever made a film called The Power of the Dead. Paranoid Nurse?
The Living Dead. I changed it.
The Living Dead.
Oh, The Living Dead, sorry. It's not. Neither of them's listed. The one that doesn't exist and the one that does. I want to tell you that I often wonder who is the wonderful narrator of all your series. This guy who's terrific. And now I know.
That's very sweet of you. It's not a question.
Right, one last question. Hot and Jupiter over there.
It's not. Maybe it's a question. So, do you think the possibility of actual Discordianism as being that story is a relevant one? I mean, I think we're entering into the age of chaos. It's one of the many things that Robert Anton Wilson correctly predicted. Trump and the rise of the right in America have shown it. And I think to give people a narrative that weaves it together, Discordianism itself, cynicism about cynicism, including cynicism, the narrative's been created for us. It's there. It's ours for taking if we would totally pursue it and to put it into the world, as we are trying to do here.
Well, if Discordianism is that narrative, then that will happen. But Discordianism might be a narrative that is on the way to the narrative that we don't know. The future is very fast and very chaotic at the moment. But I think that the Discordian movement certainly seems a healthy thing for the moment. It's probably leading to something.
It seems like everybody, the whole world, I think John did an amazing article for Rob Anton Wilson's birthday about how
Operation Mindfix.
Yeah, but it's in the real, what Wilson was talking about in the early 70s is now reality. It's what's happening. It's like fake news and nobody knows what anything.
I think it's Alan's right, it's something on the way to something. I mean, we've just lived through 200 years of vast revolutions, most of which have been seen to fail. When that happens, chaos rules, and out of that comes a new big story. And we're in the eye of the storm at the moment, and I think those two boys who invented Discordianism were onto something, they were spotting it, but it's not going to last, and we should celebrate that moment, because actually it's a moment of great freedom, out of which you can invent new realities.
Chaos is a ladder, as I say on Game of Thrones. Right, we have to stop here now, I'm afraid. Thank you so much, Alan and David. Okay, over to you, Michelle.
Gentlemen, we now have about a 23-minute break. Please don't go too far because coming up is the wonderful Nina Conti and Kat Vincent. And can I also say a massive thank you to Dr. David Bramwell, who you will be seeing more on later.